I don't usually speak quite as fast as I am going to speak this morning, but I will not get through all this if you don't tolerate this a little bit. When you hear the name of Jonathan Edwards, what is the first thing that maybe comes to your mind? Comedian? Comedian, okay. That's a different Jonathan Edwards, I think. Anyone else? Right. Probably his most iconic and famous sermon is that of the sinners in the hands of an angry God, something you probably studied when you were in high school history class or something. Anything else that you think about with him? Well, here's his picture. I don't know what that necessarily, and that's a good picture of him, by the way, in terms of what he looked like. But Jonathan Edwards was probably one of the more esteemed individuals in this nation in terms of clergy and pastor, philosopher, theologian. He lived from 1703 until 1758, and he is well known for a number of things. R.C. Sproul has said of him that he probably is the most premier theologian that America has ever produced. He had a mind like very few. He was a key figure in the First Great Awakening in this country. He was a champion of what some would call Puritan theology. I would call that Reformed theology, Calvinistic theology. And he is, as we just said, famous for this particular sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. But he was also more than that. He, like me, probably awoke every day somewhere around 4 to 5 o'clock in the morning, and he would rise and he would begin to study. He would study anywhere from 13 to 14 hours a day. He was devoted to prayer and meditation. He would often head off into the woods and the glades and go by horseback and so on to spend time communing with God. I think it may have had something to do with the fact that he had 11 children. He was a faithful husband and father. But he valued personal holiness very much. Part of this has to do with his own upbringing. There was always a balance in his thinking between mind and heart, between logic and emotion. That was a balance that was very important to him, and he kept that throughout his days. He was born in East Windsor, Connecticut, October 5th, 1703. He was the middle child, or close to the middle child. He was the fifth of 11 children born to Timothy Edwards, who was also a pastor. And his mother, Esther Stoddard, was also a PK. She was the daughter of Solomon Stoddard, who was a very well-known pastor in Northampton, Massachusetts. He was raised, I hesitated to use the word strict, maybe intentional might be a better word, raised in an intentional Puritan household with a focus on piety and learning. He showed great promise early on. His ability to study Latin and Greek and Hebrew at the knee of his father Timothy was such that even at an early age he was showing signs of being something of a prodigy. This is a map of Connecticut, and somewhere up in this area would be where East Windsor was. I have a little better map here, but just to give you an idea of what maps were like in the colonial period. So here is Massachusetts and Connecticut, and here is East Windsor. And just to point out a couple of towns that are going to be of some interest to us. Of course, this is Long Island. New York is down here. But here is New Haven, the home of Yale University. Here is Bolton, a little town not far from East Windsor that we'll talk about. Here's Enfield, where that famous sermon was secondly preached, actually. Here is Northampton, where his grandfather was the pastor of the church there, and here is Stockbridge. So kind of gives you something of an idea that you will kind of need to know as we go along here. Here's a picture of Yale University and their chapel. And he entered Yale University at the age of 13. Now, we still know young people today who are actually should be in the 8th grade, but they're actually entering college somewhere because they are brilliant. It's not that he wasn't brilliant, but the entrance exam to most colleges was just simply having a working knowledge or ability to deal with 2 languages, Greek and Latin. And so by this point in time, at the age of 13, he was well versed, could easily navigate those languages. And so he was quite qualified to enter college. But 4 years later, he graduated as valedictorian of his class. There were 2 in his class. No, I don't know. Don't know how many there were. But he was the valedictorian of his class, and he did go on to work on his master's degree, which he received in 1723. And in his studies, he would have studied philosophy and theology and math and astronomy. Jonathan Edwards was very interested in the natural world, but when he looked at it through the lens of Scripture, through the lens of this is what God has made, okay, such that he valued nature and why he spent as much time in it and glorying in the beauty of what God had made, because to him, this pointed out something about the very nature of God. But he was also influenced by the Enlightenment. John Locke's essay concerning human understanding was of great interest to him. And those kinds of scholastic endeavors and so on always interested him. As I said a moment ago about his interest in the natural world, early on he wrote an essay called The Flying Spider and of Insects. So it gives you something of an understanding of who he was. When did he come to faith? When was his conversion and his conviction kind of solidified? And this is one of those things that is not atypical. He did not have a road to Damascus kind of an experience, having been raised in, many of us were raised in a Christian home and those kinds of things. But he was troubled as a teenager with the doctrine of God's sovereignty and the doctrine of election, to such a degree that he says at one point in time, from my childhood up, my mind had been wont to be full of objections against the doctrine of God's sovereignty in choosing whom he would to eternal life and rejecting or passing over whom he pleased, leaving them eternally to perish and be everlastingly tormented in hell. It used to appear like a horrible doctrine to me. And this is true for many folks who read the scriptures and so on, and before they really have a full understanding of it, it's like, wait a minute, how does this all jive with my understanding that God is love and all those kinds of things? For him, this began to work its way out, I suppose. When he was a senior at Yale, he experienced what he would describe as a near-death experience. He had a severe case of pleurisy. And he later wrote of this, he said, "It was as though God shook me over the pit of hell." And so he, at the age of 16, was quite disturbed and troubled by this and what might happen to him and so on. And he did what anybody does when they have those kinds of experiences. He began to not argue, but to bargain with God. And he promised he would mend his ways and all those kinds of things. But he also recognized that soon after his recovery, he said, I fell again into my old ways of sin. But something had changed in that moment, because he would also later reflect that it seemed as though, I've lost my place here. It seemed that God would not let him rest. He said he had great and inward violent struggles till after many conflicts with wicked inclinations and repeated resolutions and bonds that I laid myself under by a kind of vow to God, I was brought wholly to break off all my wicked ways and all ways of known outward sin, and to apply myself to seek salvation. In a document that he would later write called a personal narrative, he reflects further on this and says that in 1721 he experienced a delightful conviction while meditating on 1 Timothy 1:17, and found himself there embracing God's sovereignty. And I just want to read a part of this to you. He says, from my childhood up, my mind had been full of objections against the doctrine of God's sovereignty, but I remember the time very well when I seemed to be convinced and fully satisfied as to this sovereignty of God. There has been a wonderful alteration in my mind in respect to the doctrine of God's sovereignty from that day to this, so that I scarce ever have found as much as the rising of an objection against it in the most absolute sense. The first instance that I remember of that sort of inward sweet delight in God and divine things that I have lived much in since was on reading those words in 1 Timothy 1:17. Now unto the King eternal, immortal, invisible, the only wise God, be honor and glory forever and ever. Amen. As I read the words, there came into my soul and was, as it were, diffused through it, a sense of the glory of the divine being, a new sense, quite different from anything I ever experienced before. And so there we have this sense of conviction, of conversion. Being able to point to a day and time was not really possible for him, but this was a moment in which his own awareness came to be engaged in that. And this was something that shaped really his whole theological focus on God's glory and human dependence after that. Beginnings in ministry. He first served a congregation, First Church in New York. This was in the period of time 1722 to 1723, and he was delighted in his ministry there. I shared with you a couple of documents you'll find on your table. One is a timeline that you can kind of hold in front of you. The other one is on these resolutions, and I want you to take a moment to look at these, because this tells us something about Jonathan Edwards. During this period of time that he was in New York, he developed these resolutions. Notice what he says: being sensible that I am unable to do anything without God's help, I do humbly entreat him by his grace to enable me to keep these resolutions so far as they are agreeable to his will for Christ's sake. And then he gives a note to himself: remember to read these resolutions once a week. The first one, resolved that I will do whatsoever I think to be most to the glory of God and my own good, profit and pleasure in the whole of my duration, without any consideration of the time, whether now or never so many myriads of ages hence, resolved to do whatever I think to be my duty and most for the good and advantage of mankind in general, resolved so to do whatever difficulties I meet with, how many soever and how great soever. And as you begin to read through these resolutions, and there's 70 of them, when you couple this with the diary that he later writes, as well as his personal narrative and so on, these provide important clues into Edwards' spirituality. Starting from that first resolution, to do whatever glorifies God and serves people. Entries ranged from using time in the most profitable way, to remembering one's own death, to prohibiting oneself from speaking ill of others. What did our mothers tell us? If you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. To maintaining the strictest temperance in eating and drinking, to daily repenting of sins committed, to fighting against one's own sinful nature and so on. These kinds of things demonstrate to us the seriousness with which Jonathan Edwards took the call of God upon his life, that he wanted to be as true as he possibly could to the Lord Jesus. All of this happened while he was in New York, that he developed this. Now, I would think, and it has been intimated, that he would have been very pleased to have been moved from temporary pastor to solo pastor of this church. But that was not to be. His father Timothy became aware of a small congregation in Bolton. I pointed that out on the map a moment ago, that was in need of a pastor. And so he dutifully left New York, went to Bolton, and was there for a very brief period of time. But then the following year, an opening came at Yale, his alma mater, to serve as a tutor. And then from 1724 to 1726, he tutored back at Yale, which allowed him then to continue to pursue his theological studies. And this was quite important to him. Then in 1726, something happened that he probably was not necessarily expecting, but the congregation at Northampton felt that their pastor, Solomon Stoddard, was getting a little long in the tooth, and he needed help, he needed assistance. And so the family connection being what it was, Jonathan was called to serve as the assistant pastor there, and he served there until his grandfather passed away in 1729, at which point he became the sole pastor of Northampton. Now, this is a picture of a meeting house, not the meeting house in Northampton, but this is typical of meeting houses in New England during the pre-revolutionary days and so on. A meeting house was not just a church or a place for the congregation to gather, but anytime the community needed a meeting house, this is where they would come. And the meeting house in Northampton actually changed 3 times during the 23 years that Edwards was there. One time became quite necessary when the balcony collapsed. I don't know what building standards were like back then, but in any event, that's what occurred. Before we get too far along, we want to talk about his marriage to Sarah Pierpont in 1727. She was the daughter of the founder of Yale, James Pierpont, and so Edwards had the opportunity to know her from early on. There was 7 years difference in their ages, and they were engaged when Sarah was only 15 years old. Talk about robbing the cradle. That was the kind of the standard, I suppose, or it was not unheard of. But they married 2 years later in 1727, and so she was only 17 when she got married, just a year younger than when my wife got. No, I was trying. But Sarah was noted for her piety and joy. They too had 11 children, 3 sons and 3 daughters. One of the things that Edwards wrote about her at one point in time is she hardly cares for anything except to meditate on God. George Whitefield, who was also a revivalist preacher from Britain who had come to the United States, on a couple of different tours, met the Edwards family and so on. He would write in his journal later, "A sweeter couple I have not seen. Mrs. Edwards is adorned with a meek and quiet spirit. She talked solidly of the things of God and seemed to be such a helpmeet for her husband. And after meeting her, the young unmarried evangelist renewed his fervent prayers that God would be pleased to send me a daughter of Abraham to be my wife." He also wrote of them that he had not met the equal of Jonathan and Sarah Edwards in all New England. So they were certainly a spiritually powerful couple. Edwards admired her devotion, and he described her as beloved of that almighty being. Their marriage was a partnership in faith and family life. This is a picture not of them, of their family, but just a New England pre-revolutionary family, always lots of kids and so on. Now, what sparked the first Great Awakening? It actually began in Northampton with his congregation. His preaching on justification by faith alone was one of those things that led to a revival within that congregation. Edwards was always challenging moral self-sufficiency, and that's a part of what ignited the revival there. He would later document what occurred in Northampton in a piece that was called "A Faithful Narrative of the Surprising Work of God." And he always emphasized personal conversion and emotional engagement with faith. He collaborated with George Whitefield during the 1740s revival tours. Now, that famous sermon that we mentioned a moment ago was preached in Enfield, that little town not too far from where he was born in East Windsor, on July 8th of 1741. And it really became a classic in American literature. It shared vivid imagery of God's wrath and human frailty. The devil is waiting, hell is gaping for them, and so on. But what's interesting is that Edwards was not, in a sense, his preaching style was not an oratorical genius per se. It was rather flat in his delivery and those kinds of things. And the sermon had actually been preached in Northampton about 4 weeks before. And it received very little kind of a reaction. Now, his congregation had already gone through a revival, so perhaps the shine was off of that apple in terms of the sermon. But it's also true that before he preaches it in Enfield, he does make adjustments to it. He does change it. But his ability to preach in an oratorical style like Whitefield was not really the case. One commentator has said that that Edwards was not trying to, quote unquote, scare the hell out of his listeners, but his end goal was not to sort of curb their sinful behavior, but rather what he was interested in doing was 4 things, and that simply was that he wanted to induce unregenerate sinners, or people who had never yet believed, to experience a simultaneous awareness and understanding and appreciation of these 4 things: the precariousness of life, both temporal and eternal, their sinfulness, their need for saving grace, and then the availability of that saving grace through Christ. What's interesting is that he never finished the sermon in Enfield. What occurred in his preaching was that the congregation reacted so strongly with cries and shrieks of sorrow and conviction and so on, that he had to finally stop preaching because it had gotten so wild, in a sense. The emotion of the congregation was such that he had to stop. And the ministers that were there then began to comfort and counsel those that were in such deep distress. And so it was really an astounding kind of event. I wanted you to see this because this is part of a manuscript that he preached from, and you can see how small it is. I would never be able to do that. Not only are my glasses not strong enough, I preach from my iPad, and I use that 50 font in order to see. I couldn't do this. But I have seen manuscripts that are half that page. And so in one sense, they would just fit in the palm of your hand, and he had page after page after page. He had his own kind of shorthand at times that he used, but I will say that he did not get an A in penmanship. I mean, that really is something. Yale University has an entire portion of their library that is dedicated to Jonathan Edwards. And if you have any interest and so on, I would encourage you to look that up online. But this gives you some idea about how he was able to preach or how preaching went for him. The revivals were faced with challenges. He himself supported the Great Awakening, but he also criticized the emotional excesses and the spiritual pride that was found in them. There were many. This was what was referred to as the old light, new light controversy in the life of the church at this point in time. And there were new light people that were very much affected by and in favor and strong supporters of the awakening who exceeded their bounds. And by that I mean they might come into a community and make a blanket declaration about the fact that the pastors of the churches in this town are not born again. And they would criticize them for their preaching and those kinds of things. That's what he means by spiritual pride. You should not do that. But those who were part of the old light, the more established pastors and so on, were great critics of what was taking place. And all of this really had an impact on the church at large. And while he advocated for a balanced, authentic faith, that was recorded in his art or his documentation on religious affections. He also had strong standards with regards to the tensions within his own congregation. One of the things we need to remember about church in those days is that all of these folks have come from Great Britain and Europe at large, where the marriage between church and state was just normative. When those folks came to the United States, there was no government per se. I mean, King George was still in charge, but far removed. But what occurred in a community was this sense that everybody who lived in the community was actually a sheep of that flock. And so the pastor had responsibility for those individuals. Those individuals were encouraged to come to church, but many of those individuals were not yet regenerate. They were not yet born again. And so when you have a church vote, that's an issue. Or when you create a new policy, there's many that will disagree with it. Solomon Stoddard, who pastored this church for the longest time, treated, and I think this is part of my next slide, he treated communion in what I would call an unbiblical way. He invited anybody to come to the table. Even though today we would say no, the Lord Jesus invites all those who are regenerate, who have been born again, who have been baptized into the faith to come to the table. And Jonathan Edwards felt that way about it. So when he began to change things from his grandfather's old standard of inviting people to come, even though they were not yet believers, that began to create issues. And he, in 1749, introduced strict qualifications for full communion and that alienated many. He insisted not only that you make a profession of faith, but that your own life give evidence that you weren't just saying the words, but rather that there had been a change in you. These folks got tired of it, and in 1750, after serving 23 years at that church, they voted 10-1 for him to leave. That vote, however, was not the deciding thing. What happened was the leadership of the church wanted to know what's the mind of the congregation at the moment. They took the vote to give them information. They themselves were the deciding body. They were much more divided. And so by one vote, Jonathan Edwards was asked to depart. Interestingly enough, he continued to serve that congregation for another 15 months at their invitation. He continued to preach and to teach there and so on, and live in the parsonage or in the manse. But at the end of that period of time, they left, and he then became a missionary. And it was a missionary to Native Americans. They moved to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, out there in western Massachusetts and so on, and served a little congregation that was there. And their primary work was to serve as a mission to the Housatonic Indians. And it also gave Edwards a great deal of time then to write and to continue to study. And this is where he ended up writing Freedom of the Will, which was an argument from John Calvin's perspective against the argument set forth by Jacobus Arminius. And it is one of the lasting pieces of his writing and so on that is important still today. He became a real advocate for Native American education and spiritual welfare. I don't know what your millennial views are, but Jonathan Edwards would have been a post-millennial believer, which is to say that he genuinely believed that the gospel of Jesus Christ was going to convert the entire world, that everyone would one day come to faith in Jesus Christ. He had plotted this out mathematically and so on. He had a lot of reasons why he believed that. And so when he was thinking about the Indians and many other people, they're apart. And if you look in the book of Revelation, you notice that number of people before the throne that no one could number was from every tribe and tongue and nation. And so his own feelings about their well-being spiritually were true. But it was also true on that front, that you face many challenges with disease and frontier hardships. Very, very quickly, these are some of the major theological works, and there are many others. Again, I would send you to the Yale Library website and look up the Jonathan Edwards part. One of the things he wrote on the life of David Brainerd, who was a young missionary who died on the field, that book in particular became a real inspiration to many missionaries even yet today. It inspired 19th century missionaries like William Carey and Adoniram Judson. It showed his commitment to global evangelism and the spread of the gospel, and that book remains influential even today among Calvinist evangelicals. And finally, his role at the College of New Jersey, or what we know as Princeton Theological Seminary today. He was appointed president of the College of New Jersey in 1757. And of course, you can imagine his mind once again thinking about all the work that he wanted to do. That, however, was cut short. There was a smallpox epidemic that was going on, and he received a smallpox inoculation. He insisted that his whole family be inoculated. I have no idea if they were supposed to wear masks, but everybody had to get the vaccine. He had a complication from it, and he ended up dying not long after he got there, in March 22 of 1758. And interestingly, there was great tragedy really in the rest of the family, because a daughter died a few weeks later, not from that, but from another infection that she developed. And so Sarah then, who was still back in Stockbridge and so on, had to get some things settled. She was going to come to care for the grandchildren that were left behind by this daughter who had died and her family. And after Sarah arrives, not many weeks hence, she also contracted something that took her life. This is a picture, you can't read it very well, of the tomb or the grave marker and so on that's in the cemetery there at Princeton. And I thought this was rather sweet, things that he said when he became aware that he was about to die. He gave these words to a daughter, Lucy, and wanted her to pass them on, but he whispered, "It seems to me to be the will of God that I must shortly leave you, and therefore give my kindest love to my dear wife, and tell her that the uncommon union which has so long subsisted between us has been of such a nature as I trust is spiritual, and therefore will continue forever. And I hope she will be supported under so great a trial and submit cheerfully to the will of God." Those words, I think, speak of the deep spiritual bond between them. Not only does he leave a long legacy of written works and those kinds of things, but it's interesting when you look at his descendants. His grandson was Aaron Burr, who was the vice president to Thomas Jefferson. But his descendants also include 3 U.S. senators, 3 governors, 3 mayors, 13 college presidents, 65 professors, 100 attorneys, I don't know about that, 30 judges, 60 plus physicians, hundreds of missionaries and other clergy. Edith Roosevelt, who was the second wife of Teddy Roosevelt, is a descendant of his, as well as O. Henry, the famous short story writer, as well as many other persons of notable reputation. And so Jonathan Edwards is a remarkable individual. And I know we're running out of time here, but I just want to say to you, if you have any interest in reading more or studying more about Jonathan Edwards, this is a wonderful book by George Marsden. It's called A Short Life of Jonathan Edwards. There is a larger volume that Marsden has written called Jonathan Edwards, A Life. It's like 500 pages. I don't know if you're up for that.